Welcome to today's episode of Buildings Hub Live, where we spotlight the changemakers and technologies leading the charge to electrify our built environment. On our podcast, we tackle the multifaceted issues facing building electrification, from space heating to water heaters to electric cooking and beyond. On today's episode, we'll discuss the impact of the midterm elections on building decarbonization and climate policy with Julia Piper, host and producer of the Political Climate Podcast, and Justin Warland, senior correspondent at Time Magazine. In today's conversation, we'll break down the electoral outcomes and ruminate on the future with our host, Atlas Public Policy Analyst, Zach Strauss.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth episode of Buildings Hub Live. My name is Zach Strauss, policy analyst at Atlas Public Policy, and I have the pleasure of being your host today. For today's episode, we'll dive deep to discuss the outcomes and potential impacts of the recent midterm elections on the future of U.S. climate policy, and in particular, on building sector electrification. How might the results accelerate the push to decarbonize the U.S. building stock on the federal, state, and local level? What does the unexpected outcome mean for the future of decarbonization policy over the next 2 or 4 years? Today, we'll analyze the results and we'll ruminate on the future. But before we jump into our discussion today, a quick note and plug for Buildings Hub. Here at Atlas, we manage a one-stop shop data analysis tool for building sector electrification called Buildings Hub. If you're interested in current fuel prices, state policies, and federal funding programs, the current makeup of the U.S. housing stock, we've got you covered, and a lot more. Check it out today. We'd love to have you join our Buildings Hub community. We even put a link to our platform here below. Now, for today's event, we are currently live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and we encourage our audience to send over your questions, and we'll pull them in as we go along. You can do so through the Q&A portal through our YouTube channel. We really look forward to hearing from you today. It is now my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our superstar speakers. We are joined by none other than Julia Piper, host and producer of the Political Climate Podcast, and Justin Warland, senior correspondent at Time Magazine, where he covers all things climate and clean energy. Welcome to the both of you, and thank you so much for being here today on Buildings Hub Live. So we have lots to cover, only about half an hour, so we're going to jump right in. I'd like to start with the both of you just giving some high-level intros for our audience today. So what work are you involved with in energy and climate media and journalism, and how did you cover the recent midterm elections this year? Let's start with Justin.
Great. Well, thanks, Zach, for having me. Thrilled to be here. So I'm as Zach said, I'm a senior correspondent at Time, where I write about climate change and energy and clean energy in particular. I really write about these topics in a really broad way. I try to connect dots, try to tell stories that are sort of beyond the sort of daily beat story, looking at trends, looking at the way that things are playing out in different parts of the world. My approach is to jump around between things and focus on different things at different times. So in that vein, for the midterms, I did a few stories, trying to do things that weren't the traditional, like what does this mean for Congress? One of which is one of those stories was looking at state policy and, what are the implications in state houses with PUCs, with some of the other sort of critical state elections. And then I did another one looking at the sort of demographic breakdown about who cares about climate change and how that might impact their voting. I'll leave it there, but looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much. Over to you, Julia.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. Big fans of Atlas and also Justin. I really appreciate his work. So I'm Julia Piper. My official title is Vice President of Public Affairs at GoodLeap. GoodLeap is a financing company that makes it easier for homeowners to invest in electric upgrades. That's solar, battery, storage, geothermal heat pumps, of course, the regular heat pumps we all know and love. So it's been fun in the last couple of years to make this transition into the business side, having been a journalist for over a decade at E&E economy, news, green tech media, and freelance for some other outlets. And so I'm lucky enough to get that outlet still a little bit through the podcast I host and produce, Political Climate. On that show, we have a Democrat and Republican who are both steeped in clean energy policy making. And we talked about the midterms in the context of not only votes and where we thought the midterms would go, but what does it mean going forward? What will be the drivers of future clean energy policy in America, especially as we look at the House now being, controlled by Republicans, another presidential election coming up. I think we're looking a lot at, are these policies, do they have staying power, and how will they benefit people on the ground so that they do stick around for the long haul? And I think we'll talk more about that today, but I recommend the Political Climate podcast feed to dig into some of those topics.
Thank you so much. Yes, big fans of both Justin and Julia's work at both Time and Political Climate, so big plugs for them. Love to move on to our first big question. So this is for Justin. The Georgia runoffs are now firmly behind us. Electoral dust has really now settled. For those of our audience members who maybe aren't as keyed into the outcomes, what does the current congressional landscape look like on the federal level? And were there any major surprises this year?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess just at a very high level, Democrats control the Senate will control the Senate very narrowly in the next Congress, and Republicans will control the House also very narrowly. I think it depends who you ask how much of this is a surprise, but it is just historically a surprise that the first midterm election after a presidential election year, that the president's party would be relatively strong. And it's especially a surprise given inflation and some of the other political challenges. I think clearly it's going to be a complicated dynamic with both parties having to keep everybody in line in Congress. And, I suppose it's a surprise given what we were expecting, perhaps with what the results might be, but also sort of very consistent with a lot of the political challenges of recent years. Zach, I answered that very quickly.
No, that was helpful. Yes, high level, it was important. We got a Republican controlled House, a Democratic controlled Senate, but by Biden administration, and there was no red wave. I think that was the big takeaway there for me. But looking over now to Julia, thinking about the outcomes of all of the major issues on the political agenda this cycle, where did climate and clean energy land on priority lists for the electorate? So based on what we saw this year, how important is this issue to voters, and can it make or break a campaign?
Yeah, you talked about the fact there wasn't a red wave. I don't think there was really a green wave either, and people may debate me on this, but I thought it was fascinating that Democrats passed the most consequential climate bill in U.S. history, but we saw very little of that reflected in midterm campaigns. That could be a good thing. Maybe it just goes to show that this is now considered infrastructure policy. It's become a little more table stakes. I just also think it could be true that we won't see some of the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act for some time. And so Democrats were cognizant of that. Most voters heading into the midterm elections ranked the economy as their number one issue. Exit polls show that only 9% of voters ranked climate change as their number one issue, and the vast majority of them, around 90%, were Democrats. So they kind of knew maybe that was in the bag, and so they focused on other things. Interestingly, you saw the president actually highlight the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and his release of certain amount of oil heading into the midterms, rather than really hitting on the climate bill that they just passed. So I think that's kind of interesting. The Republicans, for their part, didn't really attack the Inflation Reduction Act either. So I think that's kind of maybe a new era for climate policy that maybe is a good thing, and that no one's particularly, we should celebrate our wins, but the fact that it wasn't a punching bag, I think, is perhaps good news, that everyone kind of recognizes there are real strategic benefits for the United States in that bill, and it didn't really benefit anyone to attack it super overtly. There's actually Data for Progress has information showing how many midterm voters even saw a political ad that referenced the Inflation Reduction Act. And most, I think over 65%, did not. They're not even really sure what's in it, which is, I think, a future goal, hopefully, for Democrats, is to talk more about it. But interestingly, it wasn't the focus of the midterms. And again, I think there's a good lesson perhaps in that this is infrastructure policy, this is industrial policy for America, and maybe even Republicans realize it wasn't a winning issue for them to make that front and center either.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because in the past, you would expect it to be sort of a key target of attack from Republicans. But as you said, it's maybe a new era for climate policy. Justin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, a few things. I mean, one, I totally agree. I think it's funny. I mean, not just Republicans. You think about 2009 and the cap and trade bill that actually didn't become law, and Joe Manchin, famously did a campaign ad where he shot it, with a gun, and then of course this time around, Joe Manchin is the, at least. Presented himself as the savior of the bill. And so what a contrast there. Yeah, I think, I mean, I would underscore what Julia said, just to say that it is so striking that the sort of absence of a conversation on this. And I think that in some ways reflects, sort of an uncertainty about how to manage this. I mean, while climate was not a top issue, it is clear that the American public overwhelmingly supports climate policy more broadly. I mean, the polling bears that out. And so, I think there's probably some trepidation about how exactly do you message around this. We're kind of in a new era. This bill is different from, other sort of typical climate measures that maybe they have more surety about how to message around. So I'll be very curious to see, when the dust settles on some of these other issues that have been, really dramatic in the news this year. What does that mean for climate? Because clearly the conversation has changed. So I guess that's more forward looking, but I think it's worth taking a beat here to think about that.
Absolutely. I'd love to double tap a little bit on this. You say it wasn't a punching bag. It wasn't a key priority. You said economy was probably the largest table issue for this electorate this cycle. But what about in different demographics? For example, did Gen Z or any of our younger generations, did they care more, or was it more equal across the different age groups?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because Gen Z, turned out in strong numbers, arguably were, the reason why there wasn't a red wave, and they care about climate quite a bit. And I think, even if the messaging, sort of the general narrative, isn't centered around climate, I think, Gen Z voters have a sense of, where the parties are on this issue. And I think that contributes to their thinking. And again, you could look at the polling on this, which shows, clear, consistent concern about climate as a top, if not the top issue for Gen Z. The other thing I found interesting, and I wrote about this, is some of the polling that looks at, how different, communities, different, communities of color view these issues. And there's a case to be made that certain communities of color actually would really respond well, and do respond well to messaging around climate. Though, I'm not sure that message was actually out there all that much, but there is a case to be made that can move the needle. So I think those two demographic groups are worth thinking about.
Thank you. That's important insight going into another election cycle coming up in just 2 years. So pretty short span time here to recuperate. But I'd love to move on. So we talked about the federal outcomes, what it looks like on the congressional landscape. But a lot of our policies and buildings are on the state and local levels. So let's talk more about that. Let's go to Julia and ask you, were there any important developments that resulted on the state level this year in the midterms? Are there any key regions or states that saw significant changes or that held their ground in unexpected ways?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll just quickly add on the federal side is that the House, once controlled by Democrats, they will have subpoena power, which means they can bring down the heads of agencies from the EPA, Department of Energy, et cetera, to look at the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. So while we didn't maybe see it be central in the midterms, we should not anticipate that this issue is going to drop off the agenda in any way. I think there'll be some real close looks at where the funding is going, some critical looks. We know leadership in the House Republican side intends to do that. So I just wanted to add that point for context, that it's not like we will just move on from this topic. I think it will remain a flashpoint in politics. On the state side, we saw Democratic trifectas meaning governor's office in both state legislature bodies in Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, and Minnesota. So we can anticipate probably that those states will have more aggressive climate policies under Democrat control. The politicians there had run on climate-related platforms. Across the country, 17 governors that support climate policies were reelected in the midterms or continue to maintain control. And according to a piece in Canary Media, they pegged that those states yield around 80%, could collectively yield around an 80% reduction in their state greenhouse gas emissions. That's kind of what those 17 governors have set out to do. So major action at the state level is the long and the short of it. I'd also point to Florida as an interesting case study. I think we did see the red wave happen there. Governor DeSantis was reelected. We saw major gains for Republicans in the state legislature. Interestingly, that state's also dealing with resilience related questions. It's a massive, fast-growing residential solar market. The largest utility there, Florida Power and Light, also has big decarbonization plans. Interestingly, that state relies disproportionately on natural gas. I think it's 80+% of their electricity is supplied by natural gas, although they don't produce it all in state. So it's kind of a point of vulnerability for Florida to have to bring in those resources. But interestingly, the state relies already most of it is electrified in homes in terms of heating and cooling. So it's kind of this interesting example of having made the shift to building electrification, but still relying on a fossil fuel in the power system. So it creates, I think, bigger questions in my mind about how they'll decarbonize the broader grid system, with Republican control, but also a utility that's engaged. It raises questions about the future of distributed energy resources and how they can both provide resilience in this, hurricane-prone area while decarbonizing the grid, helping those electric products actually run on clean energy. So again, a place we saw a red wave, but I think could still remain a super interesting spot for electrification going forward.
I think that's a great point. And I'll also mention that a lot of the Republican-controlled states in the U.S. Southeast have very high levels of electrification penetration and have the highest rates of heat pump penetration in the whole country. So it may not even be determinant on who's controlling governments, but also other market factors and other factors at play.
Sure.
I'd love to go now to Justin but also to Julia, if you'd like to opine as well, on looking at how bipartisan is electrification. We have, in many cases, split governments. We have a split government on the federal level. What can we expect to see over the next 2 years in this congressional landscape of split government, but also in state houses where you might have a Republican governor and some Democratic legislatures? Are there components of energy efficiency that really cross the aisle that can really bridge the partisan gap? Let's start with Justin.
It's a really good and important question. And I think what you said just a second ago is really important, that oftentimes there are other market factors that come into play. In terms of actually, moving, forward-thinking policy on this, I think it's more complicated. I mean, there is, I think, particularly, and I think we might talk about this later, at some of these state level conversations are really just super deeply entrenched, with Republicans pushing for anything to stop electrification and to, entrench gas, and Democrats going the other way, though perhaps not as strongly. So, one might think there should be, this could be an area of bipartisan support. I'm not sure that's where the conversation is, particularly in the states. I think probably at a congressional level, at a federal level, electrification, energy efficiency are things that, might be more palatable than a lot of the more aggressive climate measures. And, I could, I guess, envision them as part of some must-pass legislation. However, with a Republican-controlled House, how likely is it to wind up in any sort of spending measure? I don't know. It seems a little challenging. But I'd be curious what Julia thinks.
Yeah, Julia, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with Justin. Yeah, I don't see too much on the federal side happening. I also think the Inflation Reduction Act already set a really great framework for a lot of this. The focus now is going to be on how we roll out a lot of these programs and make sure the dollars actually reach communities and reach them equitably. Hopefully that work all continues now that we have that framework in place. I think states are going to continue to be a lot of the front line of this discussion. I was just looking up for this discussion. There are preemption laws in about 20 states that prevent a ban on natural gas. And there are several other states that are looking to impose similar legislation. So I think in some of those states, you could see incentives for electrification, sort of on the positive side, but then you could still have the states, preventing cities or local governments from actually implementing a natural gas ban. So I think that's going to continue to be a discussion. Preemption, I think, has come up in Florida. I think some states even have a sort of mixed record on this. Michigan, if I'm remembering correctly, still has kind of conflicting statutes, even though some cities like Ann Arbor are looking to electrify. I think if you look at University of Michigan research, it points out that if you did a ban on natural gas, it probably would be challenged in the courts there. So I think we're going to see a lot of this playing out at the local level. Interestingly, I think utilities have a big role to play here that transcends politics. In every state, utilities want to electrify for the most part. That's their product. And I think regulators are open to that. I think there's real value there to electrifying and making sure the grid can leverage different kinds of resources more efficiently. So you see in the Carolinas, for instance, some interesting programs around smart meters, smart thermostats, and incentivizing distributed energy in a way that works for the utility, and electrification programs linked to that. So I do think utilities could be real leaders in this, and hopefully we can come up with a market framework that allows not just utilities, but other, companies to play as well to serve customers the best way possible. But I think that kind of dialogue can happen outside of this political sphere and keep this moving forward, even if we do see some governments and Republican-led states prevent bans on natural gas happening. We could see more positive actions happening through the state regulatory commissions.
Yeah, I 100% agree. We're talking about states, and I'd love to now go through some of these key regions, some changes that we might see over the next 2 years based on the outcomes of the election. Let's start with Julia, because you live in California, and California this year passed a major budget. I think it's billions of dollars, which will include programs for electrification. And I'd love to hear sort of your on-the-ground perspectives for what you think might come out of the legislature in California this year, implementation, or out of the governor's office. What are your thoughts on that? And I'd love to particularly ask about home solar. I know there was a major debate on net metering this year in California. What do we see the outcomes of that being this year?
Yeah, well, you mentioned net metering. I'm currently waiting any moment now to see a revised proposed decision drop from the California Public Utilities Commission. We're all eagerly anticipating that, with a final vote as we speak expected tomorrow, the 15th. And net metering, as folks probably know, is compensation that customers receive for the excess residential solar power they put back on the grid. There will be some major changes coming to that program. I think broadly, the industry and regulators and utilities support a shift to increased energy storage adoption. I think we all support a shift to greater electrification. There'll be some open questions about how we transition to that future, given that there are some real battery storage supply chain constraints right now, huge demand, but you cannot get the batteries, and the prices have gone up due to supply chain issues and broader inflation in the market. So I think there's a real question, not just for California, but broadly, is how do we get to that fully electrified future and leverage distributed resources in addition to, cleaning up the grid more broadly. So we've got to get from here to there. The net metering decision is going to be critical in that. And we hope there's a smoother glide path for the residential solar sector. Also that we keep the jobs that are on the ground deploying these solutions engaged and don't have too much of disruption in the market. But taking a step back, California has already done a ton under Governor Newsom on climate. We could do a whole separate session on that. There's around $54 billion in climate spending that he's approved over the last 2 years, thanks to California's budget surplus. There's $1 billion in that budget for building electrification programs. Last year, California updated building standards and codes to encourage more electrification. Governor Newsom himself has called for 6 million heat pumps to be deployed by 2030 and 3 million climate-friendly homes by 2030 and 7 million by 2035. Just looking this up, I believe CARB, the California Air Regulatory Board, I'm blanking on their name. I use their acronym so much. They are about to vote on that scoping plan that would, implement some of these asks from the governor and actually make them part of California's policy framework. So buildings have been really central to what they've done here in the state. And you can look at the California Energy Commission, again, CARB and the CPUC to see several work threads all related to building electrification. So it is certainly front and center here. And last thing I'll say is that given Governor Newsom has been more active on the national political stage, we saw that around the midterm elections. He's been centering climate in some of his messaging. We're not sure if he'll have a presidential run, but perhaps. I think either way, he's kind of taken on a leadership role for the Democratic Party. And I think he'll continue to hit on climate issues going forward. And that broader push will continue to see him be more bold with some of his electrification goals. And that also includes banning the sale of gas-powered vehicles in the state, I think after 2035.
That's correct. And CARB, the California Air Resources Board, did ban the sale of new gas furnaces starting in 2030 in all commercial and residential buildings. But I will say that from data we got on Buildings Hub, only about 5% of residential households in California have heat pumps. 5%, right? They're in the top 10 in total numbers, but they have a very low level of heat pump penetration across the board. So they have a lot of work to do. So hopefully that $54 billion is going to really work for them. So let's move away from California. And now let's move to the Northeast, which is the least electrified region in the whole country. It disproportionately relies on fuel oil and propane and delivered fuels. But we now see that Massachusetts and Maryland have Democratic governors. New York has retained a Democratic trifecta, albeit with a smaller majority. And Pennsylvania now has flipped the legislative chamber to Democratic control and retained control of the governor's mansion in Democratic hands. So what should we expect? This is for Justin. What should we expect from this region over the next 2 years, maybe 4 years, given these changes and given just the need to electrify this region just based on the low levels of electrification and heat pump penetration writ large? Should we expect to see all electric ordinances like perhaps in New York, or what should we expect not to see?
Yeah, well, I'll just very, very briefly, I would say there's been a big push in several states. Massachusetts comes to mind, Pennsylvania, I believe, as well, to push back on or rather to allow local municipalities to set more stringent codes to perhaps set all electric ordinances, even though the state has less stringent measures. And I think particularly in Massachusetts, which now has a Democratic governor after a sort of moderate Republican governor, that's going to be a very live issue, and I believe in Pennsylvania as well. So I would expect to see those kind of conversations really pick up. Whether there's a push for state level, bigger state level policy, I don't quite know. I also think Massachusetts is just coming off of a big climate law. I'm not quite sure, but the local ordinances, I think, are definitely an area to watch. Can they go further?
Yeah, I would 100% agree. I'd also mention that you mentioned that Massachusetts in this law allowed 10 municipalities to pass stretch codes, which would allow those municipal governments to halt new gas hookups by law. So we're going to see probably more of that. I think Boston might become the 11th, maybe the 12th city to join on to that if they're allowed to. And other New York cities are probably going to do that too. New York City just passed a gas ban this year. Ithaca is going to decarbonize all of its buildings, hopefully over the next 10, 15 years. We'll see. And then other cities in the state are probably thinking about it too. But let's move on to another region that's also equally cold, equally dependent on fossil fuels, and that's going to be the Midwest. Let's go to Julia. So we saw new Democratic trifectas in Michigan, Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin maintain Democratic control in the governor's mansion. What do we expect to see here? We see a lot of momentum. There's not a lot of action to date, but are we expecting to see some change? What do you think?
Yeah, I think anytime you have leadership that prioritizes climate policy, I think that sets a tone from the top. Again, I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Are we going as far as bans that natural gas bans on that kind of infrastructure, or is it more incentivizing? I think, again, the city of Ann Arbor has a program where they're working with a nonprofit to incentivize the move to electrification. And I think that's a pretty universal and can be universally supported. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how the states go about this. I do want to circle back on one thing on California, and this does relate to other states, is it depends a lot on what the price of electricity is, right? We're talking about electrification. And in California, it can be challenging given that the electric rates are so high. I had my own home assessed to do a heat pump, and it just did not make financial sense to rip out my current gas-powered system, which was only 1 year old, and put in a $25,000 heat pump and a new duct system to ensure my home could be not only electrically powered, but more comfortable. The contractor, I'll give a shout out to Nate Adams, who is an incredible leader in the contractor world on implementing building electrification. He actually did my blower door tests and everything. And there is a real issue here of if customers make the switch to or have a newly installed gas system and you miss that window of getting them to change over, you miss that window for potentially 15 years. And similarly, if the electricity rates are too high, it can be hard to see any ROI with electrification. So I think this is going to be a challenge across multiple states, is how each of those states structure their electricity rates and make sure that electrification can actually work for consumers. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Don't get me wrong. I think we can couple things like solar energy and the distributed side with battery storage, with heat pumps, have time of use rates that encourage the right kind of customer behavior, but to work to bring electricity rates, keep them in check more broadly, making sure that utility spending is done efficiently. But all that creates a package that I think will encourage electrification in not only California, but all of these states. And I think there's going to be a lot of work to do in making sure electrification policy actually works and doesn't get too far ahead of where the market is.
Yeah, I definitely want to double tap on the rates. I think California has very high electricity prices. So does the Northeast, right? Which is going to prove increasingly difficult to electrify those areas. I do think great opportunities are people using delivered fuels. I think that's going to be an opportunity, sort of low-hanging fruit. But yeah, if gas is cheaper than electricity, it can be quite a difficulty, which is why those PUC elections and any of those elected officials that make rates and rulemaking is going to be really critical. So we're out of time today, but I'd love to now jump into our lightning round. It's tradition here at Buildings Hub Live where we finish with our lightning round with our speakers. So this is a 1 minute or less answer. I'll start with Julia. Do you see the tide turning for clean energy deployment, home solar, or electrification in the United States over the next 2 years based on the outcome of this election or in general? And what do you see the next 2 years looking like for the U.S. green economy?
I think the tide has already turned on residential solar anyway. We've proven that customers want this across the country. Doesn't matter if it's a red state or a blue state. Customers appreciate those savings. We could see up to 13% of homes having residential solar by 2030. We've actually hit record quarters for the past 6 quarters now in the residential sector, while there have been some other trade issues that have been bogging down other parts of the solar industry. And so the industry is not immune from challenges, but I think it's really a testament to the consumer demand amid rising electricity prices, amid the growing demand for energy control. So that's an exciting new trend. And I hope that it transcends, political, elections to come. I think it's now become a more mainstream element. The question for us all is how can we make building electrification reach that same mainstream status so that I think it, again, transcends any political push and just becomes part of our strategic infrastructure planning as a country. And I think part of that will be encouraging the use of US made products that I think everyone supports. And we hope to see more of that happen in the residential sector and across the board. Build it here, deploy it here, export it abroad. It's an exciting new era. I think we've turned that corner already.
Thank you so much. All right, over to you, Justin. 1 minute or less. What do you see happening in the next 2 years?
Yeah, I'm curious to see what happens when we build it here. What does this mean for politics? How do building local supply chains and local employment change the way that people think about clean energy? And then the way that people potentially vote, the way that people make their own consumer choices, and perhaps creating a virtuous cycle where people increasingly understand clean energy, increasingly want to be a part of it, whether that's being employed in the industry or pursuing residential solar or electric vehicles or whatever. And so I think it's a really interesting dynamic time. I certainly think that we've passed the tipping point, or I can't remember what you called it, Zach, but I think we passed that moment, and I'm just curious to see how fast it accelerates and how there might be a cycle created.
Thank you so much to the both of you. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for our discussion today. But I want to say a big thank you to both of our speakers for joining us, providing their expertise and their insight, and to everyone who joined our audience today who participated in our conversation. Should you wish to watch this episode again or share it with others, you can find it on the Atlas YouTube page, as well as on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. We encourage you to check out our Buildings Hub platform online and to join our electrification community. I'd like to say happy holidays to everyone, and we'll see you next year. Take us home, Kim.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Buildings Hub Live. You can listen to this episode and all other installments of our podcast on the Atlas YouTube channel, as well as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. If you're interested in additional content, check out our data, our articles, and dashboards at atlasbuildingshub.com.